Man, let me tell you something. This ain't the same India that people used to think about 20, 30 years ago. Back then, if you said India in global politics, folks thought cheap labor, call centers, Bollywood songs, maybe cricket. But let me tell you right now, that story has been thrown out the window, torn up, set on fire, and buried, because the India we're looking at today, that's a whole different beast. It's bold, it's fearless, it's powerful. It ain't looking for validation anymore. It's demanding respect, and if you don't give it, they'll take it anyway. See, power ain't just about having money or weapons. Power is when people have no choice but to recognize you. When they got to pause mid-sentence and think about what you'll do before they make a move. That's where India is right now, and that's why the tough talk, the threats, the chest thumping, it don't work the same anymore. The US can't play that game no more. You can huff, you can puff, but you ain't blowing down this house. Now, I ain't saying India just woke up yesterday and got here. No, no, no. This is years of building, of hustling, of grinding, of taking every punch and still standing tall. India got laughed at, underestimated, doubted, but they kept stacking technology, stacking trade, stacking military power, stacking influence, and today you got a country that ain't begging to be invited to the table. They're bringing their own table, their own chair, their own rules, and if you don't like it, well, too bad. Let's talk real. America used to think it could talk tough, push sanctions, make threats, and countries would fold. That worked with some, but when you throw that same playbook at India, it backfires. Why? Because India ain't dependent the way people think. India got leverage, and leverage changes the whole conversation. See, leverage is when you can look at the biggest player in the room and say, "You need me just as much as I need you." That's the switch. That's the real game changer, and India got that leverage now. Think about the economy. America can't ignore that India is one of the fastest growing major economies in the world. You're talking about a nation that went from people making jokes about poverty to becoming a tech hub, an innovation powerhouse, a space player, a global factory, and a consumer giant all at once. You got one. 4 billion people. Let me repeat that. 4 billion, that's not just numbers, that's buying power, that's labor power, that's influence power. You can't talk tough to a market like that, because if India shuts the door on you, that's billions of dollars out the window. That's companies losing sleep at night. That's politicians hearing from angry businessmen who don't want to lose access. And let's not forget, India ain't just some sidekick. They're sitting right in the middle of the world's biggest tug of war, America on one side, China on the other. Now you can't afford to push India away, because if they lean too hard toward China or Russia, that changes the whole map. So when you're making moves, you got to tread carefully. You got to soften that stance. Because if you push too hard, India will pivot, and once they pivot, it ain't easy to bring them back. Let's talk defense. Back in the day, America was the one selling weapons to allies, telling them what they could and couldn't have. But India ain't buying everything off the rack no more. They're building, they're designing, they're testing, they're exporting. You know how much power it takes to not just defend yourself, but to sell your defense to other nations. That flips the script. Now, India ain't just a customer, they're competition, and when you compete in that arena, you can't bully, you got to negotiate, you got to adapt, and boy, let's talk energy. For the longest time, the US thought it could control countries through oil, through energy supply, through trade deals, but India got smart. They diversified, they tapped into multiple suppliers, they built relationships with the Middle East, with Russia, with renewable markets. That means you can't choke them out the way you could choke others. They got options, and when you got options, you got confidence. That's why they stand tall when someone comes around talking big, because they know they got cards in their hand, and they ain't scared to play them. Now, let me bring it down to the street level so you can feel it. Imagine you're the boss at work, and for years you had an employee you thought you could push around. They showed up on time, did their job, never talked back. But slowly, that employee started leveling up, got better skills, started making connections, people in the office started respecting them, and one day you realize, hold up, if this person leaves, half my clients are leaving with them. That's when you stop barking orders and start asking questions. That's when you soften your tone. That's when you realize this ain't no regular employee no more. This is a partner. That's exactly the dynamic happening between America and India right now. And let's not act like this is just about politics. It's about culture too. The Indian diaspora in America is one of the most successful, influential communities out there. Doctors, engineers, CEO, politicians, you name it. From Silicon Valley to Wall Street to Capitol Hill, you got Indian voices shaping policy, shaping industries, shaping the future. And when you got that kind of representation inside the house, you can't talk reckless about the people outside the house. It don't work. You soften your stance because their fingerprints are on the very system you're trying to control, and then comes the global image. America knows that in today's world, perception is power. How you treat allies, how you treat rising nations, that gets noticed. You can't claim to be the leader of the free world while disrespecting a democracy that's bigger, louder, and more energized than any other. India got the numbers, the elections, the participation. People see that. So if you come down too hard, you don't just lose India, you lose credibility in the eyes of the world. And let me hit you with this. India knows its worth now. That's the dangerous part for anybody trying to push them around. Because when you know your worth, you stop settling. You stop tolerating. You stop letting people talk down to you. India ain't asking anymore. They're setting the terms, and the world gotta listen. You can't threaten someone who ain't scared of your threats. You can't shake someone who built their house on storms. India done, faced worse, and survived. So when someone comes talking about pressure, they laugh. They're like, man, this is just Tuesday for us. You know what makes it even more unshakable? The people. 4 billion people who are proud, resilient, and loud. You can't break that spirit. You can't bully a population that large into submission. And when the people stand behind their leaders, when the country is aligned on pride and progress, that creates a wall no outsider can break down. That's why every move America makes toward India now has to be calculated. That's why the tone shifted from threats to cooperation. That's why you see more handshakes, more deals, more partnerships, because the old playbook don't work. And let's not forget, India plays the long game. America sometimes plays short-term politics, looking at the next election cycle, the next 4 years. But India, they're playing decades. They're building strategies that don't just survive governments. They survive generations, and when you're thinking long term, you got patience. You can wait out the storms. You can outlast the pressure. You can turn today's tough stance into tomorrow's softened tone. Because you know they'll need you eventually, so here's the truth. This ain't about kindness. It ain't about friendship. It ain't about sudden love. This is about power recognizing power. America knows it can't afford to lose India. It can't afford to alienate India. It can't afford to act like the Billy when India got the strength, the smarts, and the swagger tossed. and up and say, "Not today." That's why the stance is softening. That's why the tone is changing. That's why the words sound different, because India ain't the same old story. It's the new headline, it's the new chapters, it's the new rulebook, and when you're rewriting the rules, even the biggest players got to stop, pay attention, and adjust. For decades, the script was simple. America spoke and the rest of the world listened. America laid down the conditions and nations scrambled to align. You wanted access to trade, you followed their rules. You wanted military assistance, you signed their terms. You wanted global recognition, you showed loyalty. That was the order, the unchallenged structure of power. But today, when it comes to India, that order has been flipped upside down. The tables have turned, the narrative has shifted. Now it is India setting the terms of engagement, not America, not Europe, not anyone else. This shift didn't happen overnight. It's the product of years of persistence, decades of struggle, and generations of ambition. India learned early on that if you're always waiting for someone else to give you permission, you'll stay waiting forever. So instead of pleading for inclusion, India started creating its own standards, its own systems, its own influence. And now, when the big powers approach, they don't come with ultimatums, they come with offers. That's the ultimate reversal. You see it most clearly in trade. Once upon a time, India was desperate for foreign investment. Companies dictated terms and India accepted, but today the story has changed. With one of the largest consumer markets in the world, India doesn't chase investors. Investors chase India. Global corporations bend over backward to adapt to Indian regulations, not the other way around. Whether it's tech giants having to comply with India's data rules, pharmaceutical firms working under Indian price controls, or social media platforms rewriting policies to stay in the Indian market, the reality is clear. India dictates the conditions. You want access to one. 4 billion people. You play by Indian rules, and in geopolitics, this shift is even sharper. America once assumed that India's role was to fall in line, to play the junior partner, to be grateful for inclusion. But India's leadership flipped that equation. Now, when the United States approaches India about strategic alliances, whether it's Kuwait talks, defense agreements, or supply chain partnerships, India enters the room not as a follower, but as an equal. India doesn't nod to everything it negotiates. It pushes back. It makes demands, and here's the kicker: America listens, because it has no choice. Without India, there's no strong counterbalance to China. Without India, global supply chains remain vulnerable. Without India, Asia tilts in favor of someone else. That leverage is what allows India to set terms. On defense, the same logic applies. There was a time when India had to rely almost entirely on foreign imports, when they could be cornered by threats of sanctions or arms embargoes. That time is over. India has built an indigenous defense industry, created joint ventures, and diversified its partnerships. America knows it can't dictate terms because India can always turn to Russia, to France, to Israel, or better yet, to its own innovations, and so the dynamic flips. When defense deals are discussed, it's India saying, "Here's what we'll take, here's what we won't, here's how it benefits us." It's not subservience, it's sovereignty. Technology is another space where India now holds the pen. For years, Silicon Valley thought of India as just a pool of engineers or a market for apps. But India shifted from being a consumer of technology to a creator of it. With space missions like Chandrayaan, with indigenous digital payment systems like UPI, with advances in AI, drones, and semiconductors, India has shown that it can set standards, and when you set standards, you set the rules of engagement. American tech companies now have to adapt to Indian innovations, not just sell their own. They adjust to Indian regulations on privacy and data because India knows value of its digital future. That's why UPI is now being adopted in other countries, making India an exporter of digital frameworks that others must follow. And then you look at diplomacy. America has long used a carrot and stick approach, rewarding compliance and punishing resistance. But with India, that stick breaks on impact. Sanctions threats, India shrugs, pressure over energy imports from Russia. India doubles down, demands on aligning foreign policy. India politely refuses and charts its own course. And the world notices when India says no, it doesn't get isolated, it gets respected. That's a level of independence that few nations can pull off without consequences. But India has reached the point where its refusal carries weight, where its dissent shapes outcomes, where its stance cannot be ignored. Culturally, the shift is massive too. America used to shape global culture, exporting movies, music, and lifestyles that everyone else followed. But Indian culture has become its own powerhouse. Bollywood, yoga, Indian cuisine, festivals, even India's soft power in spirituality and philosophy. These are not just exported, they're embraced. And when your culture is desired, your influence grows. Soft power means people see value in aligning with you, even without coercion. That cultural magnetism adds to India's leverage, reinforcing the fact that it no longer had just to fit into someone else's mold. Now, let's talk about democracy. America has long touted itself as the world's leading democracy, the example others should follow. But India now stands as the largest democracy on earth, with an electoral process involving hundreds of millions of voters, diverse voices, and powerful debates. The sheer scale of India's democracy gives it legitimacy that no other nation can match. When America tries to lecture, India responds not with defensiveness, but with its own democratic credentials. That's why global platforms look at India differently. It's not just the developing nation, it's the democratic giant, and giants don't follow, they lead. Energy is another piece of this puzzle. For a long time, dependence on imported oil and gas made countries vulnerable to American pressure. But India diversified its sources, tapped into renewables, and built strategic reserves. So when America raised eyebrows at India buying discounted oil from Russia, India didn't blink. Instead, it reminded the world of its own priorities: affordable energy for its people, sovereignty and decision-making, strategic independence. That's not defiance for the sake of defiance. That's setting the terms. That's India saying, we'll do what benefits us, and you'll adjust around it. And guess what? They did. Because America couldn't afford to alienate India at the risk of losing its partnership in Asia. And in the multilateral world, India has carved its space as a rule maker. At forums like the G20, BRICS, and SCO, India speaks with authority. At the United Nations, its voice carries weight not just because of its size, but because of its moral positioning. India pushes for reforms, for recognition, for equity, and slowly the conversation shifts. Even the idea of expanding the UN Security Council cannot be discussed without India in the equation. That's the clearest sign of the change from being excluded from the room to being central to its future. What's remarkable is how calmly India holds this power. It doesn't flaunt it unnecessarily. It doesn't shout it from the rooftops, but it applies it strategically. That patience, That confidence is what unsettles others. Because it's one thing when a nation demands loudly, it's another when it simply acts as though it already has the authority. India behaves like a leader, and so the world treats it like one. That's how you set the terms. This entire transformation rests on one foundation: self-worth. India finally realized it doesn't need to wait for validation from the West. It doesn't need to beg for recognition or bend under pressure. It knows its value, it knows its contributions, it knows its power, and when you know your worth, you walk differently, you speak differently, you negotiate differently. That's why India's voice now carries a weight it never had before. It's the voice of someone now carries a weight it never had before. It's the voice of someone who knows they can walk away from the table and still be just fine. That's power, that's leverage, that's the real shift. So today, when America approaches India, the tone has changed. It's not, here's what you must do. It's, how can we work together? It's not, follow our lead. It's, let's align our interests. It's not, accept these conditions. It's, what conditions work for you? And that subtle but monumental shift marks the rise of India as a true power, not a power in waiting. Because at the end of the day, the old order relied on the assumption that India would always be reactive, always catching up, always proving itself. But India is done proving. India is now deciding. And once you start deciding, once you start setting the terms, the world can't treat you the same way anymore. That's the new reality. The engagement begins on India's conditions, shaped by India's priorities, filtered through India's lens. And that's why America's stance has softened, because it has to.